in Hanoi?
It's very strange, I have to say, because the reference points are all very displaced. You know, when you read this in the United States, it's you're reading to an audience that identifies with that displacement because America is a country of immigrants. But when you read it in an ancient city that sort of originates Vietnamese nationality, it's almost like you're visiting a landscape that sort of the point of the beginning, not the point of departure.
Imagine me sitting here translating from a group of musicians in this very room who played music from the 15th century. And we had stuff going on and poetry from that. And the young Vietnamese in this country didn't care about the Vietnamese translations because they all speak English.
Oh.
And so, yeah, that's another part of the strangeness that one experiences here in Vietnam. And Ben, how is it reading in Hanoi?
I gave a lecture in Vietnamese in Saigon at the Social Sciences and Humanities University in Saigon. And, that was quite different. It was much more formal, rigid. And to read here, I mean, I think that to be among Duc and Andrew, I feel like a very simple writer, in the sense that they've done such a good job of portraying this notion of displacement that, I think it's apparent in the differences in our style. To me, that is quite strong. And I've heard Andrew read numerous times all around the United States, and I feel stranded. I feel, as an American writer, I'm not really an American, I mean, I dabble in it, but I'm really an American academic, an intellectual. And, there's the professional academic field and then the Vietnamese literary field, which I really don't fit in. And the changes in vertiginous Vietnam is, to me, very alienating. There's no more room for Vietnamese American voices. It's as if the country gives two shits about us. The country's moved on to their Bentleys. I'm sure we've all seen Bentleys. And to me, it's very disorienting and alienating to read here. Very marginalized, actually. Whereas, when I first came as a Fulbright, it was completely different ballgame. Everyone wanted to know what I was thinking, what intellectual theory, philosophy I was reading, what I was studying, what I was researching. But now it's as if, my cultural capital is somewhat increased with degrees and positions and publications, but it is it's a very lonely place for me to be right now.
Well, you can imagine what it's like for me to live here and write in both languages and publish in both languages. But don't just reflect on the fact that 5 years ago, what happened tonight could not have happened. That Vietnamese Americans would not have had a chance to read it. Not at the US Embassy, not at any cultural centers, not at any centers, but now things are happening. And that kind of thing is as disorienting and as alienating to you as it is. We'll find an audience here. There are people here, including writers and intellectuals, who are trying to understand what it is Vietnamese American things are like. My own girlfriend over there was telling me she's now have access to the internet, and she's able to see films and read things and understand a little bit more of what I go through and what I tell her about, which she hadn't thought about before. And it's a whole different worldview, different paradigm, and yet we're together. And it takes a lot of work. And there are moments when I'm sure she doesn't want to be with me, and there are times when there's no possible way for me to explain this to her. So I can understand that. But I think you're doing great, and certainly by Andrew, by being here. I wonder whether you want to have your pieces translated into Vietnamese?
People have asked me that. I mean, I have another book coming out, and well, I guess the answer would be simply yes, but I don't really think about it too much because I think mostly I write for an American audience. Well, although I have been approached by Vietnamese who say they really learn or were inspired by my work, and it's always a great bonus point to get that. But I think I started writing simply because I wanted to explain myself to people who don't know me. And but now it seems that my work is now has another angle, which is to inform people who come from the same cultural background, but are not being able to access some of these things because I'm somewhat more bicultural than they are. I don't know. And so it's kind of good to imagine that it's going to be read by Vietnamese in Vietnam, I suppose. But I really hadn't really thought about it.
Yeah, I was talking to Matt Steinglass, who's been in Vietnam for a long time. He's been writing for DPA, Deutsche Pressedienst, and others, and the Boston Globe, and Voice of America. And he's talking about how Vietnamese in Vietnam receive novels written about the war in the U.S. And it became this, he sent me an email and I said, I'll just answer this I'll try to be as helpful as possible. And it turned out to be 4 pages of, well, when you talk about the American novels about the war, the worldviews, the grunt stories, the dispatches, the madness which Americans viewed this thing in the alien society, and yet the Vietnamese don't see themselves in this way. And how do they meet this? And then the kind of education, the kind of exposure the Vietnamese have to this thing. And the Vietnamese novels about the war and what happens now. It's a young generation that's moved on from there as well. And so it was just constantly, and then Matt read my email and he came back down and we talked for 2 hours as to the sort of narrative that Tim and Brian will present of this craziness, of the darkness, the heart of darkness of Vietnam apocalypse now. And yet there's a whole new society, a whole new young generations. And there are people here that are questioning all this stuff, and I find that what we go through is an alienation of biculturalism. It's happening in Vietnam in slightly different form than you may be able to tell me. But Hung, for example, paint these images, and he does these installation where he questions the old Vietnamese traditions. It has nothing to do with the war or being displaced. And yet he is alienated in some ways by the traditions, because the paintings you see have elements of ethnic fabric, ethnic designs. The folk sayings on the lighters that you'll see in the other room, Hung talks about them because he's grown up with them. But he's also a young artist living in the now modern Vietnamese, globalized Vietnam. And what do these old traditions mean for somebody of his age? And that happens now in Vietnam. And when we go to the US, you and both Ben and women carry this Vietnamese thing, and yet, what do we do with it? Because America is a different world, but Vietnam is becoming a different world, right? So let's take some questions.
I wanted to speak or to address less the Vietnam experience, which is fascinating, but your sense, Andrew, or yours, Ben, of bringing your own perspective and experience to an American audience. And I'm just wondering, because I have been struck with a kind of growing body, although I can't say that I've read widely of it, of immigrant literature, and I'm thinking particularly of Jim Lehrer books and short stories about being Indian American and straddling 2 worlds. And I guess I'm wondering that aside from the kind of Vietnamese character, how much do you feel part of, kind of just a more generalized immigrant experience that may not be specific to Vietnam, maybe a little bit more general to immigrants in general, or at least to Asian immigrants, getting, especially in, context of somewhat tension, but certainly attention over immigration in the U.S. Is it getting more play? Are you getting a louder voice?
Wow, that's a long question. I think Ben addressed this better than I do, but for me, when I write something, even though it's specifically Vietnamese, for instance, there's always an awareness of writing it in a most accessible way for people who may not know anything about my background, and yet when they read it, they feel an immediate identification. And that's because I find that increasingly in the United States, people are in search of their identity, and even if you never move, the borders move you. So I was on a plane, and this one lady who is from Silicon Valley or San Jose, she was 90 years old, and she sat on a plane with me, and she looked down as we were landing in the Bay Area, and she said, all this is orchards when I was a child. And of course now that whole area is run by immigrants who are from China, Vietnam, Korea, and so on, who are basically building the internet infrastructure. And so she never moved, but the whole world had moved around her, and she knows Vietnamese cuisine really well, So it's not about just me telling you about who I am, but that by reading that kind of work, you are also discovering an America that otherwise you cannot access. Yeah.
Just like to follow on to that. I think it's very difficult to give up one's history, and I think it's an extremely hard thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe your parents' generation had a hard time with it than
Yeah.
you do. But what I do feel is that America has an extraordinary role in the world that nowhere else, Europe, actually I'm going through the same situation as you, but from a different kind of background, that nowhere else has really embraced immigrants in the same way. So it worries me when I look at America. I wonder how one protects this. I wonder how you protect the country to go on embracing people and moving and being a vision in the world that is more than about economics or power. And you're an American now, and I wondered what you feel about that. How do you resolve that? It seems to me America has something that nowhere else in the world has, even Australia, which is perhaps the nearest.
Well, I would say that if there is a struggle for me intellectually, is to broaden the definition of what an American is.
Mm-hmm.
And by deepening it on the complexity level of saying Vietnameseness is also part of Americanness, that the two, what seemingly opposed spheres are in fact overlapping. That, my next book is called East Eats West. And, and it's about how Asian culture is changing the American taste, American point of view, so that, in fact, ketchup is no longer central, but it's actually salsa, which is a different sauce. We don't like it sweet, we like it spicy. We are shifting our sensibility, even though maybe intellectually we haven't grasped the fact that the ground has moved so much. And I think there is a lot of a body of literature waiting to be written on this whole idea of pluralism. Of course, there's a lot of pitfalls and xenophobia that come along with it, but in fact, as long as pluralism is respected and embraced, I think there's always hope for America.
I just want to say, Andrew is one of the founders of New America of California, which has become New America Media, which is bringing together media from all these different groups of people writing in different language or thinking in different ways, and making them available both in English, and making that point of view understood by the larger public. And Andrew has been instrumental in doing that and influencing other media organizations. And the fact that Ben is now at Vanderbilt, an American institution, teaching comparative lit, bringing Vietnamese literature, whether it's from the 30s or from modern Vietnamese literature, the fact that that's happening just the willingness in America in some ways of accepting these voices. What bothers me is that we still have to fight to get that voice out, and I keep saying these are true American voices. They're no longer hyphenated Vietnamese or Italian or Irish American voices. These are American voices. And as long as America accepts these voices, I get on the air and I speak with a different accent on the air, and I read my name in the Vietnamese way on the air in public, and first, even when people work with me at KQED, it's like, you can't do it. Well, I'm not anglicizing my name. But I've learned to say Smith, and it's time I learn to say something else. It's just a different name. But it's a struggle for